The woman I had spent 20 years trying to forget was standing 3 feet away from me beneath the lights of our hometown fair, holding the same kind of silence that had once broken my heart. She looked older, of course. We both did. But I recognized her eyes instantly. Then she looked at me, smiled through tears, and asked the one question I had spent half my life trying not to hear: "Why did you never answer my letter?" My hands went cold because there was only one truth I had never been brave enough to tell her: I had never received it. If you believe that some people are meant to cross our paths twice, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness, because this story is about second chances, the kind that sometimes arrive years after we think the door has already closed. 20 years earlier, I had been 17 years old, awkward, broke, and hopelessly in love with the girl who sat beside me in history class. Her name was Emily Carter. She had a laugh that could make the worst Monday feel like summer and a habit of tucking loose strands of brown hair behind her ear whenever she was nervous. I never told her how much I loved her. At least, not properly. Instead, I fixed her bicycle when the chain slipped, carried her books when she had too much to hold, and waited outside school whenever she had to stay late. We were best friends who were both too afraid to admit that friendship had quietly become something more. Our hometown was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and dreams were often measured by what you could afford. Emily wanted to study art in another state. I wanted to become a mechanic and someday open my own garage. We used to sit on the hill behind the football field and imagine what our lives might look like 10 years later. She promised she would come back one day. I promised I would still be there. At 17, promises felt permanent. Then my father lost his job. A few weeks later, he suffered a serious accident at the factory, leaving my mother and me struggling to keep our family afloat. College became impossible. I left school shortly after graduation and began working full-time at a repair shop across town. Emily knew I was struggling, but I never told her how bad things had become. I was ashamed. She had a scholarship waiting for her, a suitcase packed, and a future stretching in front of her. I couldn't bear the thought of becoming the reason she stayed behind. On the night before she left, we stood beneath the old oak tree near the fairground. Neither of us said what we were thinking. She hugged me tightly and whispered that she would write. I told her I would wait. But inside, I had already decided that waiting was selfish. She deserved a life bigger than our little town, and I convinced myself that loving someone sometimes meant letting them go without asking them to stay. The next morning, Emily left. For months, I heard nothing. Then one rainy afternoon, an envelope arrived at my house. It had no return address, only my name written in handwriting I recognized immediately. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a short note from my mother, telling me that my father had been taken back to the hospital after complications from his injuries. I was needed there immediately. I put the envelope down and rushed out. By the time I returned home 3 days later, the letter was gone. I searched everywhere. My mother thought I had thrown it away. My father remembered seeing it on the kitchen table but didn't know what happened to it. I assumed Emily had simply decided not to write after all. Pride stopped me from contacting her. I told myself that if she truly wanted me in her life, she would try again. She didn't. Or at least, that's what I believed. Years passed. My father eventually recovered enough to walk again, and I worked until I could afford a tiny repair shop of my own. I married young, believing perhaps that love could be built through patience even when the heart wasn't ready. The marriage lasted 6 difficult years and ended quietly. There was no betrayal, no dramatic argument, just two people realizing they had spent years trying to become happy instead of admitting they weren't. After that, I stopped looking backward. I built my business. I hired 2 young mechanics. I bought the house I had always dreamed about. Life became steady, but never quite full. Every autumn, when the hometown fair returned, I avoided it. Too many memories lived beneath those bright lights. Then, 20 years after Emily left, I made the mistake of going. The fair was bigger than I remembered. Children ran between food stalls, music floated above the crowd, and the smell of caramel apples filled the cool evening air. I was standing near the old Ferris wheel when someone called my name. I turned. Emily was standing there. For several seconds, neither of us moved. She wore a simple blue coat and held a paper cup between both hands. Her hair was shorter now, and there were faint lines around her eyes, but somehow she looked exactly like the girl I remembered and completely different at the same time. She walked toward me slowly. I tried to smile, but my face wouldn't cooperate. She told me she had come home because her mother was ill and that she had been visiting for several weeks. Then she looked at me with an expression I couldn't understand. It wasn't anger. It was hurt. Finally, she asked why I never answered her letter. My heart seemed to stop. I told her the truth. I never got it. She stared at me as though I had just rewritten 20 years of her life. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. The paper was yellow with age. She explained that she had written it the night before leaving for college. She had told me she loved me. She had told me that she didn't want a different life if I wasn't somewhere in it. She had even written that she would come back if I asked her to wait. She had mailed it to my house. I told her about the envelope that disappeared while my father was in the hospital. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then Emily began crying. She said she had spent years believing I had read her letter and simply decided she wasn't worth answering. She had eventually married someone else, built a career as an art teacher, and raised a daughter. Her marriage had ended years earlier. She said she had carried that unanswered letter through 3 different homes because part of her had never stopped wondering what I would have said. I admitted that I had spent 20 years believing she had forgotten me. We both laughed sadly at the cruelty of it. One missing letter had turned 2 young people who loved each other into strangers who spent decades blaming themselves. We walked through the fair together that night. We didn't pretend the lost years hadn't happened. We talked about everything we had missed, her college years, my father's recovery, her daughter, my failed marriage, the businesses we had built, the people we had lost. Somewhere between the Ferris wheel and the old oak tree, the pain began to feel lighter. But there was still one question neither of us wanted to ask. Could 2 people who had missed their chance 20 years ago still have another? Weeks passed after the fair. Emily returned to the city where she lived, and I went back to my garage. We began sending messages, first cautiously, then every day. We talked about ordinary things, coffee, work, bad movies, memories from school. It wasn't the desperate love of 17-year-olds anymore. It was quieter. Deeper. More honest. One Saturday morning, Emily showed up at my garage carrying a box. Inside was the old bicycle I had repaired for her when we were teenagers. She had kept it all these years. I couldn't speak. She told me she wasn't asking me to recreate the past. She didn't want to pretend we were still 17. She simply wanted to know whether we could finally give the truth a chance. This time, I didn't hesitate. Months later, we stood beneath the same oak tree where we had once said goodbye. The fair was happening again, and music drifted through the evening air. Emily reached for my hand, and I held it tightly. We never got our teenage years back. We never got to experience the life we had imagined on that hill. But we discovered something more valuable. A second chance doesn't have to erase the years you lost. Sometimes it simply gives those years a meaning you couldn't see before. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to Ripple of Kindness. Your support helps these stories reach people who may need a little hope today. And before the story ends, I want to ask you something special. Comment, I believe in second chances, if you believe that some doors deserve to be opened again, even after years have passed. Because sometimes life doesn't take away the person you love. Sometimes it simply makes you wait until you're finally ready to understand why they matter.